Today we're doing something a little bit different. You may have seen many of our tier list videos where we rank kings and queens. We've covered all the kings and queens from 1066, and we've also covered the Anglo-Saxon kings of England. However, today, what we're going to do is we're going to use a tier list format to rank World War II German tanks. You can see the selection of tanks we have at the bottom of the screen here. For example, we have Panzer Is, Panzer IIs, Panzer IIIs and so on like that, Panthers, Tiger tanks, and also the more experimental tanks such as the Mouse. We are going to rank these using a tier list format. At the top we have the super section, which is reserved for the best and the greatest Second World War German tanks. We have A, B, C, and then finally at the bottom of our list we have terrible German Second World War tanks. Those tanks that were useless and very, very poor belong in this part of the list. So enough talking, let's get on with it. First of all we have the Panzer I. The Panzer I came around in 1934. It was a light tank and 1,493 of them were built. The Treaty of Versailles restricted Germany from having tanks. The Panzer I became the first mass-produced tank of the Wehrmacht. It was conceived to be a training tank and was used for scouting, spearheading assaults and supporting infantry. It was very efficient in the fall of Poland and had a max speed of 37.5 km an hour or 23 miles per hour. It weighed in relatively light at 5.4 tonnes and had a range of 58 miles. Its main armament was a 7.92mm MG34 machine gun. When creating one of these lists, we come up with good points and bad points of each vehicle. One good point about the Panzer I is that in 1940 it was rearmed with a Czech 47mm gun, which resulted in the Panzerjager I. It also saw combat in Spain, Poland, France, Denmark, Norway, Russia and North Africa. The Panzer I was a very effective training tank and was also effective as a radio communication tank and was successful in this within the Blitzkrieg. Early on, the Panzer I was very successful due to a lack of anti-tank weapons. One negative of the A model of the Panzer I was that the armour was only 30mm thick at its thickest. There were also many problems with suspension, propulsion, overheating, and the commander had to be the gunner and also the loader of the two machine guns. The A model was also very underpowered and not viable in combat. The command tank also only had room for the radio and transmitter, and there were no weapons capable on this vehicle of defeating enemy tanks. In terms of where we're going to place the Panzer I on our list, we're going to place it into the A tier. Although it had poor armour and a poor armament, its value in history is extremely important with leading the Blitzkrieg. Next up we have the Panzer II. The Panzer II was the main light tank of World War II, and 1,856 of these were built. It saw service between the years 1936 and 1945. It had a crew of 3 and its speed was 39.5 km an hour or 24.5 miles per hour. It had a Maybach HL62 petrol engine which gave out 138 horsepower. The Panzer II is a very iconic German vehicle. It had an effective role as a reconnaissance vehicle and it's the most numerous tank of the early war. It was also very lightweight. Obsolete Panzer II turrets were reused for defensive bunkers as well. And also it had the addition of the anti-tank gun on the top. In terms of negatives for the Panzer II, it still had quite weak armour, and it had a very small caliber gun, a 2cm main gun, with an MG34 secondary gun. It only had a 78 mile range as well. In terms of where we're going to place the Panzer II on our list, we're also going to place it into the A tier. During the early war, it was a dominating machine, however quickly got outgunned by later tanks such as the T-34. The next tank we're looking at is the Panzer III. This is the first German medium tank and also classed as the best. 5,774 of these were built. They were used in North Africa and could sufficiently engage M3 Stuarts and Crusaders, but they fell short against British Matildas and M3 Lees. They were an early war favourite and production began in 1937. And they also boasted a 3-man turret. One positive of the Panzer III is that many of these were built, and the godfather of these was Heinz Guderian, who's known as the father of the Blitzkrieg. They were sturdy and reliable, and had a long-lasting chassis, which would then form the basis of the Stug IV, a successful tank destroyer. They had high explosive anti-tank rounds too, to destroy other vehicles. The Panzer III had thicker armour, 2-inch all round. They were also modified into flamethrowers and had many different variations. The 3-man turret also gave these vehicles a good advantage. Negatives of the Panzer III was that much tweaking delayed its mass production, and it weighed far heavier than previous tanks. They were also not too effective against Matildas and M3 Lees, and they needed a greater firepower. They were also envisioned to be amphibious tanks, but were never used. In terms of where we're going to place the Panzer III on our list, we're going to place it in a super tier. The Panzer III had a hugely important role in North Africa and during the early war. The next tank we're looking at is the Panzer IV. The Panzer IV was the most numerous German tank built in the Second World War and was heavily modified throughout. It was introduced originally to counter the Soviet T-34. It was also exported widely, and it was in production throughout all of World War II. It had an important role at the Battle of Kursk and was seen as a warhorse of the German army. In terms of advantages of the Panzer IV, it was the most numerous tank of World War II, and 8,500 of these were built. The chassis would also be used for other tanks such as the Stug IV. They weighed in at around 18 tons, which was relatively light as well, and the range was 130 miles. They could also be up-armoured and featured a 7.5cm gun. The Panzer IV in Africa was also superior to any Allied tank. In terms of negatives, the short 75mm main gun was inadequate against the T-34's armour, and also a KV-1, KV-2, and also the French Char B-1. The slow rate of production left France and Poland being invaded with Panzer Is and Panzer IIs. In the later war, they were vulnerable to Sherman Fireflies and could be defeated at a longer distance. We're going to place the Panzer IV in our super tier. The Panzer IV belongs in the top of our list. It was built in a huge number. It could also defeat many of the other vehicles that previously the Panzer I and Panzer II would have struggled against. The German Panther is classed as one of the best tanks of the Second World War. The Panther was designed in response to the T-34 and was heavily armoured and featured greater firepower. It was first used at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 and was fast and manoeuvrable. It's also, like I said earlier, to be considered one of the best tanks ever made. It was also absolutely huge. If you've ever seen one of these, you'll see what I mean if you're stood next to one. In terms of positives, it was fast and manoeuvrable and featured a 700 horsepower Maybach engine. It had an accurate and powerful 7.5cm main gun, which would be capable of penetrating 150mm or 6-inch armour at a range of about a kilometre. It took 7 months from approval to the tanks being on the assembly line as well, which is relatively quick. It also featured side-panelled armour and sloping armour. One negative of the Panther tank is it was unreliable. Like the Tiger, engine fires were common. It also had a high fuel consumption. The original plans say that the Panther was meant to be 30 to 35 tons. However, the thicker arm that was insisted weighed the tank down more. The Panther also features interleave road wheels, which took a while to mend. You would have to remove different wheels to repair ones which were behind, which could take a long time in the battlefield. The size of the gun was also not suitable for street fighting and boggy terrain, being 15 feet long. There is no arguing where we can place the Panther. It had a huge impact in later tank design and also in the main battle tanks that we see today. In terms of where we're going to place the Panther on our list, it also belongs in the super tier. As you can see, we've got many different tanks that are near the top of the list. We will see some later on that are rather poor and terrible though. The next tank we're looking at is the infamous Tiger I. The Tiger I was a heavy tank that was a product of Germany's experience of fighting in France in 1940. The Tiger proved a formidable opponent for Allied tank crews, and it's extremely famous and was used in Africa and also in Europe. Today there's very few Tigers around. However, if you do go to the Bovington Tank Museum, you can see one that's still running. One positive of a Tiger tank is it's heavily armoured. It forced enemies to create new technology in guns as well. It had 60mm side hull plates and 120mm armour on front. It also featured the powerful 88mm flat gun, which was capable of knocking out even the heaviest of the Soviet tanks. It's an extremely iconic vehicle and boasts a kill ratio of 10-1 against Allied vehicles in defensive strongpoints. It's also attributed with 9,850 kills. It forced the British to adapt and create the Sherman Firefly as well. What's sometimes underestimated too is the psychological effect that seeing a Tiger I tank would have on the battlefield. However, there are a few drawbacks. For example, it was expensive to manufacture and would cost $250,000 Reichsmarks. Many of the Tiger tanks also broke down. It was complex and prone to technical problems. The interleave road wheels would also be complex to change in a battlefield. It featured an extremely heavy weight, weighing around 60 tons, and it wasn't capable of using most of the bridges. It also had a limited range and was time consuming to build. In terms of where we're going to place the Tiger on our list, we're going to place it in the super section. Although Tiger I has some negative points, for example how much it cost, it's an extremely iconic German vehicle. The next tank we're looking at is the Tiger II, which was the most formidable tank of the Second World War and was also known as the Königstiger or the King Tiger. It was the largest and heaviest tank fielded by the Germans in the Second World War and featured a crew of 5. On the positive side, it had frontal armour that could withstand all Allied anti-tank weapons. Its 88mm gun could also knock out most of what the Allies had on the battlefield. It also featured slope armour to deflect shots and was intimidating and iconic. If you've ever stood next to one of these, you'll see what I mean. They are absolutely colossal. There are some drawbacks though of the Tiger II. For example, like the Tiger I, it was extremely expensive to manufacture. A Tiger II tank would cost 800,000 Reichsmarks. Also, the engine was extremely unreliable, and only 489 of these were built, and there were too few to save Germany. It was also very heavy, weighing in at 70 tons, and was underpowered for its size. In 1943 and 1944, when these were introduced, it was rushed, and it strained the armaments industry as well. In terms of mobility, there were many different mechanical issues with the Tiger II, for example the interleaving wheels, and it struggled to cope in rough terrain and cross bridges. It had a poor range of 68 miles too, and also a very low speed. Spare parts on a Tiger II were also a nightmare to get hold of towards the end of the war in Germany. In terms of where we're going to put the King Tiger or the Königstiger or the Tiger II on our list, we're going to place it into the A section. Not as iconic as the Tiger I, however an extremely important tank for the Wehrmacht. The next tank we're looking at is the Maus, the heaviest fully enclosed armoured fighting vehicle ever built. Only 5 of these were ordered, but only 2 hulls and 1 turret were completed, with 1 turret being attached. The Maus is classed as one of Hitler's wonder weapons, and is an extremely interesting tank and vehicle. It was fitted with a 128mm gun, and was extremely powerful enough to destroy any Allied vehicle that was fighting in the Second World War, at a range of 3,500 metres or 2.2 miles. It also featured front armour that was 240mm thick, and side and rear armour that was 200mm thick. There are a lot of drawbacks though of the Maus. One of these is it was never used in combat. It weighed over 180 tons and was slow and travelled at only 11 miles per hour. The weight also made it unable to cross any bridge, and it was only considered a prototype. Historians state that it was a waste of time as well, and it came too late in the war. At the time of production as well, the Maus would have been extremely vulnerable to air attack. In terms of where the Maus goes on our list, it's an extremely interesting vehicle. However, its practicality and usefulness on a battlefield would state that it probably belongs at the lower end of our tier list. In terms of where I believe it goes on our list, I'm probably going to place it in the terrible section. Although it was only a prototype, it was too late to save Germany. So as you can see, our list is stacking up quite nicely. We've got a lot of tanks towards the top end of the list. We've also got the Maus at the bottom. Our next tank to look at is the Panzer 35T. It was Czechoslovakian made and built in a Skoda factory, and was designed as a light tank, used mainly by the Germans. The T in the name stood for the German word for Czechoslovakian. Germans seized 244 of these when they occupied Bohemian Moravia, and they saw combat in the early Second World War. One positive of the 35T is it had 50mm thick bulletproof glass protecting the driver, and it was praised for being robust and versatile. There were many seized through taking over lands as well, which basically was free tanks for the German, as production would happen in the factories of the occupied territories. The armour could also withstand shrapnel and machine gun bullets. However, on the negative side, its pneumatic system was susceptible to extreme cold, and also 37mm anti-tank shells could penetrate the armour quite easily. The 37mm gun could do nothing as well against later tanks like the T-34, and was rather weak. In terms of where the 35T goes on our list, although it was a free tank and in a sense a bargain for the Germans as they got it from occupying different territories like Czechoslovakia, we're probably going to place it in the B section. It wasn't the most powerful tank, but also it served a purpose in the early war. Next up's the Panzer 38T, very similar to the 35T here. After annexing Czechoslovakia, Germany continued producing the 38T. It was more powerful and reliable than the Panzer I and Panzer II, and over 1,400 of these were built. It was used in France and Poland and the Soviet Union until 1942. The chassis would then be used for tank destroyers. At the time, it was the best armed and armoured and most mobile tank that Germany had. The use of 38Ts led to Rommel's Ghost Division as well, and the capture of 460 French tanks and 97,000 Allied prisoners. The chassis was used for 75mm Jagdpanzer 38 Hetzers as well, which would go on to become rather infamous. It was also very cheap to produce this vehicle. In terms of negatives, the 38T was a light tank that was eventually outclassed, and using checked steel was sometimes brittle, and it was cursed by German crews. Also, crews would prefer Panzer IVs and then Stug IIIs instead of using a 38T. In terms of where we're going to place the 38T on our list, we're going to place it in the A section. It had a rather important role at the time of the early war. Also, its chassis had a long-lasting legacy, being used in the Hetzer tank destroyer. Next up we have the Stug III. The platform stemmed from the Germans needing a mobile artillery system, and it was the most produced armoured assault vehicle of Nazi Germany. The chassis was based on the Panzer III, and the first Stugs were armed with short-barreled 7.5cm guns. Later, they were fitted with longer-barrelled L48 guns, which optimised it and made it more deadly. Positives of the Stug III are its cult status. It had low height and armour, and it made the ideal tank destroyer, with over 11,000 being built. It could also tackle tougher Russian tanks. It was able to be hidden and was a perfect weapon for an ambush. It was also cheaper to produce than Panzers. It also saw combat in a number of different Axis armies, and even saw conflict in the 60s between Israel and Syria. A negative of the Stug III is its lack of turret, and also it had a problem with mobility, being vulnerable at close combat with infantry. The crew would also have very poor visibility. In terms of where we're going to place the Stug III, it's going to belong in our A section. The next vehicle is the Panzerjager I. This was the first German attempt to provide their forces with mobile anti-tank firepower. The Panzerjager I matched captured Czech guns with the Panzer I hull, and 202 of these were built. They featured a 47mm pack gun. One positive of the Panzerjager I is its greater mobility than having a towed gun. They also reused Panzer I hulls, and recycling parts was an important part of the war, and was also very cost efficient. The gun could also destroy most of the tanks at the time at distance. It was also a very light vehicle, weighing in at 6.5 tons, and it could go around 25 miles per hour. The gun could not destroy T-34s, Matildas, the Shah B, or the KV-1, and only 202 of these were built. The crew behind the gun had to expose themselves to danger, and they were blind in urban combat and in suppressing fire. The gun also had poor penetration. In terms of where the Panzerjager I goes on our list, we're going to place it in the C section. This is because overall, it wasn't the most effective German tank. The next vehicle we're looking at is the Marder I. In 1941, German anti-tank guns proved to be ineffective against heavy armoured Soviet tanks. The Soviets were making heavier armour tanks at a greater rate. The Marder vehicles were also an urgent response to the German requirement to give more mobility to the new Pak 40 towed gun. One positive is it did provide mobility to captured Soviet guns, and also to German 75mm Pak 40 guns. Overall though, the Marder I isn't the greatest tank. For example, it could not effectively engage with enemy tanks, and only 170 of these were built on a Lorraine chassis. They were also not fully armoured due to having the small chassis. The Lorraine chassis we're talking about actually belonged to a tractor. Also, the upper armour of the tank only protected tank crews against shrapnel and small arms fire. We're going to place the Marder I in the terrible section of our tier list. This is because it was rather ineffective against enemy tanks. Next up we have the Marder II. Now the Marder II used the chassis of the Panzer II, which was obsolete by 1942 when they were built. 650 of these were built and armed with Pak 40 guns. Another 200 were armed with a Soviet 76.2mm F-22 field gun. One positive of these vehicles is they provided a greater increase in firepower over contemporary German tanks in 1942. They also saw action on all European fronts. Marder II was also more effective than towed anti-tank guns. However, its high profile and open-topped armour led to minimal protection to tank crews. The thin armour compared to counterparts as well was a negative, and it had many different weaknesses related to its survivability. It was also extremely vulnerable to artillery fire and also grenades. The Marder II is an improvement on the Marder I, however you can still see a number of different disadvantages with it. In terms of its reliability, that's certainly a negative, however it did provide a greater increase in firepower for the German army when they needed it. The Marder II on our list we're going to place in the C section. The Marder III was based on a Czech Panzer 38T and used a converted Russian 76.2mm gun or the German 75mm Pak 40 gun. A total of 1,736 of these were built overall, with many of them being converted. One positive is they added significant firepower to contemporary German tanks, and mechanically they were quite reliable. The firepower could also destroy the majority of Soviet tanks. Many of the negatives also feature the poor armour that was seen with the Marder II and the Marder I. They were thinly armoured, only protecting the crew from shrapnel and small arms fire again. The open top also meant that operations in urban areas and close combat was extremely risky. Being vulnerable to artillery fire, they were extremely poor armoured when compared to a Stug IV. In terms of where we're going to place the Marder III, we're also going to place it in the C section of our list towards the bottom end. There was a need for armoured infantry and support vehicles that could fire high explosive shells throughout World War II. These were especially needed to deal with solidly built city buildings in much of the German territory that they were invading. The Brummbar was based on the Panzer IV chassis. It was used at Kursk, Anzio and also at Normandy, and over 300 of these were built. They used 15cm Stug 43 howitzers. One good thing about the Brummbar is the ability to add armour to it, and it was also effective and destructive against structures. The modification of the Panzer IV chassis was also cost effective. It was also armoured on a superstructure where the gun is, unlike Marder's. It could also mount an MG34 onto the front of it when assaulting towns. In terms of negatives, it lacked a traversing turret with an extremely heavy and slow vehicle. Its top speed was 25 miles an hour in ideal conditions. It was also a tall vehicle, which was difficult to conceal and also stuck out like a sore thumb. Also, the Brummbar could get bogged down in mud and in poor weather. We're going to place the Brummbar in the B section of the list here. It probably sits around the middle. It wasn't the most influential, but did serve a purpose in destroying different city buildings and structures. Next up's the Nashorn Hornisse. The Nashorn used a chassis developed from a Panzer IV. It was later renamed the Hornisse and was the first tank destroyer to mount the highly effective Pak 43 gun. 473 of these were built. The Hornisse's gun was good at long range, which allowed the vehicle to stand off from the enemy. It was also an efficient vehicle to produce using a Panzer IV chassis and also used many Panzer III parts. It could also defeat Soviet tanks at a range of between 2,000 to 4,000 metres away. The 88mm round could also tear holes in a T-34. Negatives, however, are the fact that its turretless design meant the whole tank would need to be turned to fire the gun. It was also heavy and rather slow, and its tall profile made it hard to conceal. In terms of where we're going to place the Nashorn in our list, we're going to also place it in the B section. It's not the most iconic tank, but did serve a purpose at the time. The next vehicle on our list is the Ferdinand, which was also known as the Elephant. The hull was Porsche's unsuccessful design for the Tiger tank, and over 90 of these were built, fitted with a Pak 43 gun and a fully enclosed and fully armoured superstructure. It was also absolutely massive. One positive of the Ferdinand is it was extremely effective and destructive and could destroy the T-34 at a range of over 3 miles. It was also well armoured and had an average kill ratio of 10-1. However, mechanical failures plagued the Ferdinands. When the tank would fail, the crews would become an easy target and would become quite vulnerable. Its huge size and weight affected its mobility, weighing over 66 tons. The tank also featured pistol ports which weren't really effective when moving. Inside the tank there was also a lack of peripheral vision, and also a missing second armament. The Soviets would also swarm these tanks with grenades and Molotov cocktails, easily destroying them. In terms of where the Ferdinand goes on our list, I've actually seen one of these and they're absolutely colossal. However, it wasn't the most effective tank and only 90 of these were built. They were also easily destroyed by Russian crews. In terms of where the Elephant or the Ferdinand goes on our list, we're going to place it in the B section again. If you have seen one of these before, you'll see how big they really are, and also its kill ratio of 10:1 can't really be argued with. Next up we have the Stug IV, or the Sturmtiger IV. There was a large demand for Stug IIIs, which meant after bombing raids on the German factories, the Germans had to adapt the Panzer IV chassis to keep up with demand. Around 1,140 of these were built. They were used as an assault gun or an anti-tank vehicle. In terms of positives, the Stug IV was actually lighter than the Stug III, and it was a highly effective anti-tank vehicle, especially on the Eastern Front. Its powerful 75mm Stug 40 gun was also very effective. It also had a secondary armament, an MG34. On the front of the superstructure it had 80mm armour as well. It could also be manufactured quicker than many other tanks such as a Jagdpanther. In terms of negatives, it came quite late in the war and didn't have too much of an impact. It also didn't replace fully the Stug III, and it worked with them. However, very few of the Stug IVs actually remain today. In terms of where we're going to place the Stug IV on a list, we're going to place it next to the Stug III in our A section. We only have 4 tanks to look at now. Next we have the Jagdpanther, which was based upon the Panther. It was extremely well armoured, it was mobile, and possessed heavy firepower. It had a capable weapon that was used in an ambush or defensive positions, and 415 of these were built. It was one of the most iconic tank destroyers of World War II, and entered service in 1944 and in the latter stages of the war. There are many different positives of the Jagdpanther. For example, it could destroy any Allied tank. It was equipped with a fearsome 88mm Pak 43 gun, which was accurate at over 3,000 metres, and it was also one of the best anti-tank guns. It also features sloped armour and thick armour all around. It was also as fast as the M4 Sherman, despite being heavier, and was made during a poor state of German production. The secondary gun featured would have either been an MG34 or an MG42. Some people have considered it to be a mobile pillbox as well due to its armour. It also featured a low profile that could also be hidden quite well. It did however have some drawbacks. One of these is it was extremely heavy at 46 tons, and at the time of the war, when it was made, there was a lack of spare parts. The crews that were serving on them weren't really the most experienced too, and the interleaving wheels were hard to repair on the field. The gun also featured a limited traverse, which meant that the tank also had to move with it. For being one of the most iconic tank destroyers in the Second World War, we're going to place the Jagdpanther at the top of our list. Personally, it's one of my favourite military vehicles. Standing next to one of these, you can really appreciate the size of the beast. The Jagdtiger was the heaviest armoured vehicle of World War II, and weighed in at a colossal 71 tons. It used the same suspension as the Tiger II, and featured a 128mm Pak 44 gun. It saw brief service in small numbers from late 1944 on the Western and Eastern Front. The gun that the Jagdtiger had could defeat any Allied tank at long range, and it's also seen as a very iconic tank. It was fully armoured, which offered good protection, and several pieces of artillery still couldn't penetrate the armour. Negatives, however, are the excessive weight that caused problems with the Jagdtiger's mobility. It was plagued by mechanical problems, and crews destroyed them when they were broken down. It's estimated that 20% of these tanks were broken by their own crews. The limited traverse of the gun could only reach 10 degrees too, and at the time of the war, there was a lack of training for the crews. Although the Jagdtiger is an iconic tank, it came too late in the war, and was also possibly too heavy. In terms of where we're going to place the Jagdtiger, we're going to place it in the A section of our list. Hetzer used a hull based on the Panzer 38T. The Hetzer was smaller, lighter and cheaper than any other Jagdpanzer. Around 2,800 of these were made. They were fitted with a 75mm Pak 39 gun. There are many different positives and negatives of the Hetzer. I've seen videos where they've been referred to as mobile coffins. One positive is the small size, which meant it could be hidden and it could ambush enemy forces. The sloped armour and low profile of the Hetzer also gave it good defence, and its use of a proven chassis was very reliable. The gun could knock out nearly all of the Allied vehicles at long range, and its fully enclosed armour protected the crew quite well. One negative is they weren't popular with crews and they were very cramped. They also struggled against heavy tanks. The poor side armour and limited gun traverse made it poor in defensive situations as well, and if hit, you didn't stand much chance of surviving inside of the tank. In terms of how iconic a Hetzer is, it probably belongs at the top end of our list. However, its survivability when hit wasn't very good. However, remember this is only my opinion, but I'm going to place the Hetzer in the A section. The final tank we're going to look at is the Sturmtiger. The Sturmtiger is based on the Tiger chassis and is an assault gun which was heavily armoured. It had a powerful rocket assisted mortar on it that was extremely devastating, and it featured a 38cm mortar fitted to the front of the tank. Only 18 of these were made, and they were used in the Warsaw Uprising, the Battle of the Bulge and the Battle of Reichswald. They were designed specifically for urban combat. Good things about the Sturmtiger is that it featured a huge gun that could cause devastation at a maximum range of 6,000 metres. It could also penetrate 2.5 metres of concrete. It also featured a ball-mounted MG-34 secondary armament. It also used up damaged Tiger tank hulls, which saved money. Negatives, however, focus on how big it was. It weighed 66 tonnes and could only carry 14 rounds with it. There were also no resupply vehicles made for this tank, and it had very little use towards the end of the war. The fact that only 18 of these were made and it was rendered relatively useless is also a negative. In terms of where we're going to place the Sturmtiger on our list though, because of how devastating that gun was and the mortar, we're going to place it in the C section. This is mostly due to the fact that towards the end of the war, it wasn't very effective and useful, however could cause a lot of devastation. As you can see, we've got many different tanks in different sections. We've got a number of different tanks including the Panther and the Tiger I that belong at the top of our list. You can see that many of the German tanks also, such as the Hetzer, the Panzer II, do feature in the A section. If you are looking at this as a conclusion, you're probably going to say that German tank production was rather varied. Bold inventions such as the mouse were extremely bold and nothing more than that. However, the more practical and reliable vehicles were extremely good in the Wehrmacht. Remember, this is only my opinion. If you would like to have a go at making a list yourself, please follow the link below to have a little look. Once again, thanks for watching The Untold Past. The support you've given us over the last few months has been fantastic. If you do disagree with any of these, please place a comment below and we'll get a historical debate going. Once again, thanks for watching. If you do like these videos, please support the channel by subscribing.